Hello everyone, this is Jason Tondro, and I'm your professor for World Lit. And we're filming today at my home, and my dogs are right here. So if you hear growling and barking, don't be alarmed. There's nothing outside. It's just my home entertainment system. Okay. We're here today to talk about the beginning of the Renaissance and the poetry that I asked you to read for this week, which is sonnets, including Plutarch, Shakespeare, and John Donne. But before we'll get to each of those in turn. We'll do Shakespeare and Plutarch and Donne. But first, we should talk about the Renaissance in general. And you've got some introductory material in your book about the Renaissance. I don't want to duplicate that, but I want us to think about a couple of simple questions. For example, how were the people of the Renaissance different than the people of the medieval period? It's hard for us to, put our mind that far back and think, well, were their priorities different? Were they physically different? How were they different? It's hard for us to really understand the magnitude of the difference, at least in their culture and in the world that they inhabited. Although, inside, we might argue that people are always people. They always want the same stuff. They want to be able to live their lives and control their own destinies. They want to have enough food on the table and a roof over their heads, and they want peace rather than war. But the society in which these people lived had drastically changed. And if you think about, for example, what was our world like before the internet, for example, most of you guys, you can't imagine, you don't know what the world was like before the internet, but your parents remember. The change between the medieval period and the Renaissance was much more drastic, but it also took place over a much longer time period. So let's ask ourselves, okay, so what were those changes? What are we talking about when we talk about the difference between the medieval period and the Renaissance? Okay, first, people in the medieval period were poorer. How did this happen? So the Black Death was not one plague. It was a series. It wasn't just the bubonic plague. It was a series of plagues, as many as 16 of them, that took place over a couple of centuries. And many of them were brought on ships, trading ships that had come from outside of Europe. But for a couple of hundred years, these plagues ravaged the countryside of Europe, and they especially took root in the cities. The common wisdom on the plague is that it killed, on average, about a third of everybody in Europe. So look at the list of your friends on Facebook and figure, okay, 1 out of every 3. Just start going down the list. 1, 2, 3, dead. 1, 2, 3, dead. 1, 2, 3, dead. And you start to get an idea of the magnitude of the amount of the casualties. But actually, in the cities, in the towns, where people were crowded much closer together, where sanitation was much worse or non-existent, the plagues killed twice that many, 2/3 of the population in cities and towns. Well, put on your economics hat for a minute and ask yourself what happens when 1/3 of all the population dies. Everybody else inherits. That is, the amount of wealth doesn't decrease when your wealth is measured in gold or land or buildings or whatever. The wealth doesn't decrease. Only the population does. And so the share of that wealth per person grew. Secondly, labor cost. Before the plagues, labor was cheap. You had as many people as you wanted to do whatever you needed. If you were a landowner and you needed somebody to tend your crops, well, you could pay them nothing but enough food to live on, and that would be enough. Okay, now fast forward a couple of hundred years. Now you need people to tend your crops, and there aren't enough people. So you might have to actually pay them some amount of money, at least more than the food subsistence level you were paying them before. When the population size decreases, the cost of labor goes up. So people have more money, and they're getting better wages, And there was a huge lack of population in the cities. There was a massive gap there, and a lot of people from the country went into the cities to fill that gap. So now you've got more urbanization and all of the social changes that brings. Okay, so the people of the Renaissance they were more well off. I'm not saying they were all rich. There are plenty of poor in the Renaissance, but the average standard of living went up. And the changes in the economy continued to spread from that, with things like higher wages, and that meant higher prices, and a growth of a middle class, of a merchant class. What else? What else caused big changes in the medieval and the Renaissance period? In the medieval period, 95% of the population were united by one thing. They were all Catholic. They had a common religious social framework. And you could go from Ireland to Constantinople, and there would be changes in how that Catholicism was practiced, but it was all Catholicism. And there was a shared legacy of the Roman Empire. So Latin, as an intellectual language, united intellectuals across Europe. Well, the Renaissance sees the Protestant Reformation. And you have people like Martin Luther, and others who begin to protest corruption, deep-rooted corruption in the Catholic Church, which we've looked at in Dante, for example, who was so beautifully illustrative of the corruption in the church when he talked about simony, for example, and all those other sins. So the Protestant Reformation leads to a breakup of the Catholic Church into, so you still have Catholicism, but then you have other religious groups like the Lutherans, and in England, and specifically, you have Henry VIII's movement to create the Anglican Church, which no longer answers to the Pope, which answers to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And in the Renaissance, they didn't fight wars over land primarily. They fought wars over religion. And nations like Spain were Catholic, and nations like England were Protestant. And you couldn't get ahead in that society if you were not the official religion of the state. If you were from Scotland, for example, which was Catholic, and you came to try to get ahead in the court of Queen Elizabeth, who was Protestant, well, you were never going to get anywhere because you were a Catholic. And this social conflict, this religious conflict, was, it was serious enough to kill over. And you could argue that that's not so different than today, where we still fight a lot of wars over religion. But without getting too much into politics, I will humbly suggest that we actually fight wars over oil, and we just pretend it's about religion. All right, so what else? What else big changes between the medieval period and the Renaissance period? Okay, guns. The social structure of the medieval period, at its top, the top of the social order, is the knights, the kings, the lords, the aristocracy. Why are they on top? Well, because they are the baddest of the bad dudes in the land. They have got the armor, and they have got the swords and the horses, and nobody can resist them if they start killing folks. And when the bad guys invade, whoever those bad guys might be, or when there's trouble in the county, you could rely upon the knight or the lords to defend you. That was their job. The oaths of fealty, which people swore to their lord, I promise to obey you and do what you command, was answered by an opposing oath of fealty from the king to his vassal, to the knight to the individual underneath him, and that was, I promise to use my power to protect you. This is the social compact. It didn't always work. In fact, you could argue that it was honored more in the breach than the observance. But the social structure of the power of the knight or the lord or the king to command was based on his military prowess. Well, you could teach someone to shoot a gun in an afternoon. and that armor was no good against a bullet. Now, it took a long time for guns to develop to the point where they could be hand carried, and a guy with a gun could shoot a knight dead. But through this time period, it took a couple of 100 years for that to develop, but develop it did. And you start off with cannons, and cannons could blow the snot out of a castle. If you just give them enough time, they'll demolish a castle to nothing but rubble. You put some explosives underneath a wall, and it's over. Well, this undermined the claim to authority that the medieval knights, lords, and aristocracy had. And they had to start looking for new reasons to explain the fact that they were on top. This became increasingly difficult as the centuries wore on. For a long time, they could keep doing it because of their wealth. Not only were they more powerful, physically more powerful than anybody else, but they were also richer. Dogs on a hardwood floor. All right, so they were also richer. Well, that didn't last. Pretty soon, as exploration arose, and we started to get places like the New World and trade with India and trade with China and so on, the finances of the middle class, of the merchant class, the people that owned the ships and that were able to make trade happen, they started becoming much more wealthy than the lords and the kings did. All right, but that full effect didn't happen till later. All right, so let's talk about that next thing that we've already mentioned, exploration. This whole idea of a new world. The discovery of America was a huge financial opportunity for the nations of Europe, especially Spain, England, Portugal. They discovered a new place, and although there were already people living there, Europe classified them as an inferior civilization, and therefore raping and pillaging it of everything that it had was morally justified, and the people that did that got that money and brought it back home, were very lucratively rewarded by the kings and queens of Europe. There was a lot of personal profit involved here. But the whole discovery of this new continent transformed society. The idea that, wait a minute, you mean we may not be the center of the universe, that there might be things out there that we haven't discovered yet, that there have been these people that have been living on this world and doing their lives there for maybe 1,000 years, that it turned out to be much longer than that, but, how long have they been there doing their thing, and we never even knew about it? What do they know that we don't know? And in the poetry and the drama and the writing of the time, everyone is obsessed with this idea of the new world. John Dee calls it the new Atlantis. Bacon writes about it. Utopia, in our book, which we're not going to read any of Moore's Utopia, but is also sort of riffing on this idea of the new world is discovered, and what do you think has been going on in that world that we don't know anything about? You couple this with changes and discoveries in science, in astronomy, and man's role in the world. And you have Copernicus, who develops the idea that maybe that the Earth isn't the center of the universe, that in fact everything revolves around the sun. And you had Galileo, who further postulates that the Earth is turning, and that the sun itself is moving. If you build a telescope and you aim it at Jupiter, it doesn't have to be a very good telescope. It can be pretty simple, and Galileo's telescope was pretty straightforward. and you aim it at Jupiter, what do you see? Well, you see a little spot on it where the red spot is. But what else do you see? You see moons. Jupiter's got a lot of moons, but 4 of them are big enough that you can see them with a telescope from the Renaissance era. So now you're looking out at another planet out there, and there's stuff circling it. Wait a minute, I thought everything circled us, right? I thought we were the center. What if there's other moons around other planets that are also circling them? What can you count on anymore? What can you say for sure about anything? Well, all of this stuff created... Oh, there's my dog. All this stuff created huge social transformations in Renaissance culture, and people weren't quite sure what to do about it. And you have a lot of change and a lot of upheaval. And then you add to this one of the things that makes the Renaissance distinctly the Renaissance, and that is our rediscovery of classical literature from the Greeks and the Romans that had been lost during that medieval period. Plutarch, who you read for this week, calls the Middle Ages the Dark Ages. This is a gross oversimplification. The idea that you would paint the entire Middle Ages as a kind of lights out period. We've been reading all kinds of wonderful literature from the Middle Ages. They weren't dark to the people that lived there, or to some. I suppose that if you read Beowulf, you could think, well, to those people that were living that time period, life was pretty dark. Well, that may be so, but they made some really great literature. Anyway, a lot of this classical literature, and I'm talking about Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and plenty of people from the Roman time period, a lot of that literature was lost in the collapse of the Roman Empire and the centuries of warfare that followed it. But those books were not lost to the Muslim people, to the Islamic empires of the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain. Islamic scholars understood the importance of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and all those guys, and they had translated all of that literature into Arabic. Well, then 1,000 years goes by, and in the 1300s, 1400s, and so on, merchants in contact with Islamic scholars find copies of Greek and Roman classical texts translated into Arabic. And they find people who can translate them out of Arabic back into Latin or Italian or whatever, or Greek. And we discover that a lot of these books that we had thought were lost forever were in fact not lost. And this lays the seeds of humanism and the Renaissance, where we try to go back and we try to look back at what can we learn again from those old texts. What do we still have in common with the people of ancient Greece and Rome? All right, so all of these forces are working together, and the Renaissance begins in Italy and it moves across Europe. And that's why, for example, we're reading Plutarch in our book on the Renaissance, but he was a contemporary of Dante, whom we read in the book on the Middle Ages. These time periods do not have a clear-cut opening and closing. They bleed over and they overlap, and there's a lot of changes going on in the Renaissance over this time period, and it's all kind of messy. All right. Once again, look at your introductory material, and then we'll talk about Plutarch next. All right? Let's pause for a minute. All right, we're back, and we're going to talk about Petrarch. Petrarch's introductory material starts on 164, and then the poems themselves go on 168, only for a few pages. Now, if you look at these pages, the first thing you'll notice is they don't look the same. Our Petrarch sonnets are translated by a number of different people, and some of those translations are done in more or less prose. That is, they don't preserve the structure of the sonnet. The sonnet is a very specific poetic form. It's 14 lines, 8 lines, and 6. The rhyme scheme varies depending on whether you're Plutarch or Shakespeare or somebody else, but it's got a specific length, and also the length of the line is very specific. Well, if you look at some of these sonnets, for example, the first one, it doesn't look like poetry. It doesn't have a line length. Well, that's because the translator did not. A translator of anything is forced to make some very difficult decisions. Are you going to preserve the literal meaning of the word? Is that what's most important? Or are you going to try to preserve the rhythm, or the rhyme scheme, or the length of the line? And in this case, the translator of some of these chose, look, it's less important that the poem looks like a sonnet, that it's got X many beats per line, or that it's got 14 lines. And it's more important that the sense of the sonnet come out. Well, these are decisions that translators have to make, and it makes reading any of these poems in a foreign language an imperfect task. If you look at Sonnet 62, it's that and the last one in our collection, 333, are the best examples of a translation which actually preserves the sonnet structure, so that when you're looking at it, it looks like a sonnet. What is a sonnet? The word sonnet in the time period, in the Renaissance, just meant song. In England, people would publish a whole book of songs, of poems, of all kinds of varying lengths and sizes, and would call them sonnets. It's only later that the sonnet came to have that particular specific form that we now associate with that word. When you read these poems, they're going to sound terribly cliched, because so many of the things that we associate with love poetry, Plutarch thought of first. He wrote his sonnets to a kind of imaginary woman. There was a real woman that it was based on, but Laura was her name. But Plutarch didn't have a real relationship with her, and she died, and he continued living and writing poetry, and so his poetry it's better to think of it as not written to the real person, but written to a kind of imaginary version of that person, a kind of fantasy Laura. He plays with the metaphor of the name, Laura, so that it's used in the sense of a laurel, which is a crown of leaves that you'll see Virgil wearing, for example. If you looked up the Dore illustrations of Dante's Inferno, you always could tell Virgil because he was the guy that had the crown of leaves around his head. The laurel crown was a mark of artistic excellence given out in imperial Rome. And if you were, one of the top writers or poets or artists of the day, then you could wear the laurel. So Plutarch plays with that, and Laura becomes the laurel, right? The laurel tree and the laurel crown. But his poetry to her, it sounds very cliche to us now, but that's because Plutarch's influence is so widespread, and he creates this love poem form of the sonnet, and everybody else plays with it until it becomes a kind of cliche in and of itself. Let's look at poem 62. Father in heaven, after each lost day, each night spent raving with that fierce desire which in my heart has kindled into fire, seeing your acts adorned for my dismay. Grant henceforth that I turn within your light to another life and deeds more truly fair. So having spread to no avail the snare my bitter foe might hold it in despite. The 11th year, my lord, has now come round since I was yoked beneath the heavy trace that on the meekest weighs most cruelly. Pity the abject plight where I am found. Return my straying thoughts to a nobler place. Show them this day you were on Calvary. Plutarch, okay, so what do we make out of that? Okay, you're being asked to evaluate poetry. Poetry is not easy to figure out. It's a challenge. Everybody acknowledges this. So let's talk about specific practical tips. First, when you're reading a poem, don't stop at the end of every line unless there's punctuation that tells you to stop. If you're reading a line that doesn't have a comma, doesn't have a semicolon, then just keep going. Try to avoid a sing-song voice when you read a poem. Try not to go, ta-da, 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 ta-da. Try to avoid that kind of singing rhythm. Try to read it as if it was just regular lines in a book. If the poet's done his job, any rhythm or meter that's built into the poem will come out naturally in your voice. All the best poetry readers just read poetry like any other word. Okay? Next. If you can't understand what a sentence or a line is saying, translate it out of poetry into just ordinary language and try to figure out from that, one line at a time, what it's saying. This is exactly the opposite of how many successful poets write their poetry in the first place. Ben Jonson was a contemporary of Shakespeare, famous for his poetry. When Jonson wrote poetry, he would just write a line of ordinary language, and he would do this for every line of the poem, and then he would try to find a way to translate that line into more poetic language with the same meaning. Okay, so do the opposite. Take the poem, and then just try to go one line at a time and figure out what he's saying one line at a time. And it's not fast, and it takes a lot of work, but you're not going to make anything out of these poems otherwise. Start anywhere. The 11th year, I'm on the 3rd stanza. I'm on page 169. The 11th year, my Lord, has now come round since I was yoked beneath the heavy trace that on the meekest weighs most cruelly. I was yoked like an animal. He's talking about like the way that an ox or a horse is tied to a wagon or a plow to pull it. And in this case, 11 years, we can go back to his biography that in the previous pages, we find out that, okay, we're talking about 11 years since he first saw and fell in love with Laura. And this love is compared to this collar. You'd think love would be happy. But this is a sad poem in which he compares his love to a burden. A burden that he wants to shake off. Because he knows that it's unrequited forever. I mean, it's a hopeless love, and he knows that it's hopeless. But you can't just make yourself unlove somebody when you're in love with them. And, when you start to figure out what Plutarch is talking about in these sonnets, you start to connect with them over these hundreds of years. And you start to realize, well, yeah, this is the sort of thing that a lot of people feel. A lot of us have felt that. You have an incredible affection for somebody, and they're never going to return that. And you want to just stop feeling this way, but you can't just wave your hand and make it go away. And so Plutarch asks God to help him. God, make me stop loving her. Fill me instead with love for you. He knows that's what he should be doing. Grant henceforth, this is lines 5, grant henceforth that I turn within your light to another life and deeds more truly fair. That the love that he has now, it's not really beautiful or happy at all. It's miserable. Let me make something useful out of my life. And I can only do that with your help. I can't get rid of this love on my own. I need you to come do it for me. Come meet my dog. Come here, Frankie. Come on. Come on. There. There's my dog. she's a puppy, so she's pretty fast. Okay. Let's look at the last one. 333. Go, grieving rhymes of mine, to that hard stone wherein under lies my darling, lies my dear, and cry to her to speak from heaven's sphere. Her mortal part with grass is overgrown. Tell her I'm sick of living, that I'm blown by winds of grief from the course I ought to steer, that praise of her is all my purpose here and all my business, that of her alone do I go telling, that how she lived and died and lives again in immortality all men may know and love my Laura's grace. Oh, may she deign to stand at my bedside when I come to die, and may she call to me and draw me to her in the blessed place. Some students just find these poems incredibly depressing. Oh, I want to just go out and slit my wrists. Let's look at this poem and ask, what is it trying to say, other than just, I'm depressed? Laura is dead. But our author, our poet, cannot relinquish his devotion to her. Tell her I'm sick of living, and I'm blown by winds of grief from the course I ought to steer. Once again, the poet knows he should be living a better life. He knows he should be living a more productive, happy life. He shouldn't be spending his whole life mourning this person that's dead and gone. That there is such a case as over grief. But he can't stop. He's powerless to stop. And he spent his whole life immortalizing her. This is the last poem in the sequence. He spends his whole life immortalizing her, so that she's going to live forever, not only in heaven, but also in a literary sense, so that people hundreds of years later who have to take, English 2111, will still be reading about Laura. He's made her immortal. But what about his life back then? That's all been spent for her glory. Is that the right way to spend a life? And he hopes that when the time comes for him to die, that she will be there, that she will appear there, and pull him to heaven alongside her. Maybe that's the reward that he gets. Maybe it's not about this world. It's not about the suffering and the wasted years. Maybe there's a payoff. And in that place, he'll learn that this was the right thing to do. It's a man wondering if his life's work will be vindicated by the future. How many of us, you guys are young, it may not have struck you, but I guarantee you that at some point in your life you're going to wonder, have I spent my life right? And once I'm gone, is anybody going to give a damn? And these are the things that Plutarch is asking. I spent my whole life making this poetry, and I poured my life out onto it. Will it be worth it? It's a question he cannot know the answer to. All he can do is hope. Well, Petrarch's influence on the other writers that we have been reading was profound. Chaucer may actually have met him. Chaucer traveled to Italy during the time period that Petrarch was alive. And he came back, and the influence of Petrarch on his own writing style is exactly what we call that period of his writing, that middle period of his writing, the Italian phase, It's got a lot of Petrarch in it, a lot of Boccaccio in it. Uh, and Petrarch's influence would reach to England, and Shakespeare and other people would begin writing sonnets as well. And you developed in Petrarch's model, you have what's called a sonnet sequence. You have a series of sonnets which tell a kind of story. And the sonnets, taken together, portray the entire life of the romance. You know, the first sighting, the falling in love, the courtship, the rejection, the betrayal, you know, the consummation, all of the various stages of a relationship are portrayed in individual sonnets in this sonnet sequence. And so if you take all these sonnets together, and there would be over 100 of them, they would tell a story. And this idea was picked up by people in Shakespeare's time, people like Philip Sidney, who we won't read. He wrote his sonnet sequence, Astrophil and Stella. It's magnificent, it's a beautiful piece. Spenser writes sonnets. As each writer takes the sonnet sequence, they try to innovate on it. So they're not just doing the same thing somebody else did. They always try to make it interesting and different. So, for example, Spenser writes his sonnets about his wife. Well, that's unheard of. You always write a sonnet about somebody else, you know, that you're not married to, that you're in love with, but that you shouldn't be, or that's rejecting you, or that you're having an affair with, or because you're single and they're married, or whatever. And Spenser said, screw that, I want to write sonnets about my wife. And so, you know, that became his innovation. And Shakespeare also writes sonnets, and we'll talk about that next. Okay, so let's pause very briefly and turn to Shakespeare's sonnets. Now, Shakespeare is the subject of some controversy. It might be worth talking about some of this now. There's a sort of popular wisdom that we don't really know a lot about Shakespeare, that he's so enigmatic that he might actually not exist at all, that somebody else may have actually written Shakespeare's plays. This was the subject of a recent film called Anonymous. This controversy dates back to the 1800s. It's basically about 150 years old. And at its root, it's a class-based argument. And it goes like this. Shakespeare didn't go to a university. Unlike, for example, Kit Marlowe, Christopher Marlowe, one of his contemporaries, a little bit younger than Shakespeare. Marlowe was the guy who was the biggest playwright of the day before Shakespeare became the biggest playwright of the day. Marlowe went to a religious school for years. He knew he had learned Latin and all of the classics. Shakespeare just went to the equivalent of middle school. In the famous words of Ben Jonson, who wrote Shakespeare's epitaph and wrote the eulogy for Shakespeare, Shakespeare knew, quote, little Latin and less Greek. He'd only went to middle school. Well, middle school, and therefore he just frankly, let's get back to our argument here. Shakespeare simply wasn't smart enough. He wasn't well educated enough to write the greatest plays in the English language. He just wasn't that smart. Other critics like Nietzsche argue that Shakespeare didn't have the breadth of experience to write the plays. And a lot of this is hinged on, is buttressed by the facts that we don't have, for example, we don't have any of Shakespeare's plays written in Shakespeare's hand. Well, all of this is circumstantial. And the argument about education, which all of this is based on, is essentially class-based. It's saying, look, Shakespeare was a glover's son. His father made gloves for a living. Only well-educated, upper-class aristocrats would have been able to make plays like this. I don't buy it. Shakespeare was a professional writer, and like any professional writer, he made the study of the world his life's work. British middle school was a lot different than what we would think of as middle school today. And Shakespeare learned some Latin, and he learned a little Greek, and he learned a little French. He had connections in the court, so although he was not himself a nobleman, he knew plenty of people that were. And he knew the people that worked in the noble households. His patrons, who paid his bills, were nobles and aristocrats. And Shakespeare spent his life learning how to be a better writer. And you see it in his work. Early Shakespeare is not as good as late Shakespeare. Well, we'll talk more about this when we get to the plays, but for now, let's talk about the sonnets. There's good evidence that Shakespeare never intended these sonnets to be published. They were circulated in hand-copied manuscripts for years before they were published. Shakespeare, in the sonnets, describes what we today often think of as a kind of love triangle. There's this handsome young man who appears to be an aristocrat, a nobleman, and there's a woman in the sonnets. She's never named. We call her the Dark Lady because she's apparently a brunette, and she has dark eyes. And Shakespeare desires this woman, but she instead falls in with the nobleman, who is also never named, but is Shakespeare's friend. And some argue, more than friend. Some of the language in some of these poems is pretty sexy when it talks about this guy. And it's suggesting that possibly there was a romance between Shakespeare and the guy, as well as between Shakespeare and the girl, or between the guy and the girl. Anyway, the way it eventually falls out is that Shakespeare ends up the loser in all of this. And he loses the girl, and she shacks up with the guy. And this is the story that's told out over the course of the sonnet sequence. If we're looking for homoerotic aspects of the poems, it's complicated because, there are points that, for example, where Shakespeare tells the nobleman that he's writing to, look, you've got to get married and have kids. I mean, look at you. You're handsome and you're intelligent and you're wealthy and you'd have such great kids. You'd be making the whole human race better if you had more children. So you should go do that. So, this question of whether or not Shakespeare was gay, or was he bisexual, or were there gay the whole word gay and bisexual, those mean very different things in the Renaissance time period than they do today. We're not going to get into a whole lot about Renaissance sexuality. We'll just note that, in the immortal words of Facebook, it's complicated, and we'll kind of leave it at that. Well, Shakespeare, not sonnet, Shakespeare. Shakespeare married. He had children, including 2 daughters and a son named Hamnet. Hamnet, not Hamlet, but Hamnet, close, very close. His son, Hamnet, died young, I think at about the age of 8 or 10. His daughter survived him. Shakespeare spent most of his working career in London, while his wife was in Stratford, a town far enough away from London that you couldn't commute. This has led a lot of us to wonder about Shakespeare's relationship with his wife. Why isn't he writing sonnets to his wife? His relationship to his wife is uncertain. A lot has been made about Shakespeare's will. in which he leaves to his wife, quote, the second best bed. So apparently they had multiple beds in the house, which makes sense. He doesn't leave her the best bed, he leaves her the second best bed. Is this a backhanded, is this an insult? Is this telling you, you were not the woman I really loved, you were the second best. The real woman I loved was this other person. We don't know. Some people have argued that this actually would have made perfect sense because the best bed was the one that you reserved in the guest bedroom for people to come to visit. But the second best bed is the one that was in the master bedroom, the one that you would have shared with your wife. And so it would have made perfect sense to give her the second best bed. Well, we don't know. It's 400 years ago. We'll probably never know. But something tells me we'll never stop guessing. Now, by Shakespeare's time, Petrarch's sonnets and all the conventions of Petrarch's sonnets, that love is like a fire and you're constantly burning and, all of those aspects, have already become cliche. And Shakespeare is already aware of all the cliches. And so he wants to try to make poetry that isn't like those cliches, that breaks out of what you think you're going to get with a love poem. So let's look at what I think might be the best damn poem ever written. And it's Sonnet 130. It's on page 179. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why, then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. Okay, what is this poem saying? This is a basic skill. You should learn how to do this. Take a poem, figure out what it's saying, one line at a time. Call it the close reading or the scan. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. The sun is bright, her eyes are dark. Coral is far more red than her lips red. We have this poetic conceit of comparing the woman to things. It's somewhat dehumanizing. It makes a woman made of nothing but jewels and objects. So she's not really a person anymore. She's just coral and diamonds and all kinds of other inanimate objects. It's an objectifying habit in love poetry. Shakespeare says, screw all that. She's not like coral. And the third, she's not like snow. She's not white as snow either. This has led some to wonder if maybe, in fact, the woman he's writing to was black. Because he specifically notes that her skin is not as pale as snow. Well, maybe. She doesn't have to be black to not be as white as snow. But it's led some to wonder. Black wires grow on her head. Her hair is not beautiful and soft. It sticks out like wires. I've seen roses. He's talking about all those poems, love poems that we read that compare a lover's cheeks to roses, the red of a rose. I've seen roses red and white, but not in her. And he says her breath smells. That the breath from my mistress reeks. Her voice is not like music. All of these cliches of the love poetry, Shakespeare just says, nope, she's got dark hair and dark skin, and her lips aren't red, and her eyes aren't bright like the sun, and her her breath smells, and her voice is not very pleasant. She doesn't have a nice sounding voice. But what does she have that all those other women, like Laura, don't have? Well, she's real. She's real, right? Remember we were talking about Petrarch, and he falls in love with this woman, and of course she doesn't love him. Same thing with Dante and his Beatrice, right? We read about Beatrice. We didn't get to the parts of the Divine Comedy where Beatrice appears, because she shows up in the end of Purgatory and then on all of Paradise. But, Dante writes this whole book about Beatrice, and she doesn't really even exist. She was a girl that dies young, and Dante's idealized her into a kind of fantasy fiction. Petrarch does the same thing. Shakespeare says, look, the woman I love, she may not be perfect, she may not have all that stuff, but she's real. She's a real person. And because of that, she's better than all those other women. It's a great poem. Number 116. I like reading these better because they're actually in sonnet form. I didn't want to read as many of the Petrarch because they're prose form and we lose a lot of the sonnet structure. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark, that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love is not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. He's arguing about the constancy of love. That love should be permanent and unchanging, and it should not change the subject or require that the subject change. In other words, you can't say, well, I love you. I just wish that you were more attentive, or I just wish that I love you, but could you lose a little weight? All those awful things. No. If you love somebody, then you got to love them for what they are, and that lasts forever. You don't need change to love. And conversely, love itself cannot change, or else it's not really love. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, that changes when it finds change. This is also an argument against novelty love, like, oh, the new person in town, suddenly you find attraction. No, that's not love. If you're feeling something just because of newness or freshness, that's not love. When we notice the play in language here, Shakespeare likes to play with language, and by showing that he can play with language, he's sort of demonstrating his awesomeness for his readers. So when we have lines like, love is not love, which alters when alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove, that kind of repetition of a word, but where the meaning of the word changes each time it's used. This is part of the poetic art. When Shakespeare says that the love is a star to every wandering bark, he's talking about a boat. A bark is a kind of ship in the Renaissance, specifically a kind of merchant vessel. Love is not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. That a person's beauty is subject to time. And time eventually takes away all of our beauty, makes us all old, wrinkly, and ugly. So our bodies are subject to time, but love is not subject to time. If you really love someone, it doesn't matter what happens to them. It doesn't matter how they change. You should still love them. If you don't, then it was never really love in the first place. We're left to agree or disagree. Let's pause there, and we'll get to the last couple of sonnets that we're reading from Donne. Okay. All right, so Shakespeare and Donne were contemporaries. They knew each other. Donne was younger, and in many ways, in his time, more famous. Shakespeare's sonnets were seen by many as the kind of last nail in the coffin of the sonnet form. I mean, there's only so much you can do with that kind of love poem structure. And after you've read a poem like My Love Is Nothing Like the Sun, there's not really any way to answer it. I mean, how are you going to go beyond that? All of the sonnets sort of been played out. And this didn't stop later poets from dabbling in it, but we don't have as many sonnet sequences after Shakespeare, very few of them. And when we do get them, they're very different. Donne, let's talk about Donne for a minute. Donne was a kind of, he was a courtier in the court of Elizabeth and then James. James the First of England was James the Sixth of Scotland. He came south from Scotland and inherited the throne of England after Queen Elizabeth died without heir in 1603. Donne was a poet of that time period, and he was a kind of seducer and troublemaker. He was handsome and young and smart, and he had a reputation as kind of a seducer. And you can see this in poems which we have not read, poems like The Flea, which you might have read in 1102. It's in our 1102 textbook. But Donne got into a love affair with the daughter of a powerful nobleman in the court of King James, and because he would never have gotten approval to marry that woman from her father or from the king, they secretly eloped and got married in private. When the king found out, he was outraged, and so was the woman's father, and Donne was essentially banished from court, and his political career was over. Donne was a Catholic, and he soon had a very large family with this young woman. I think they had 5 kids in 5 years. And James, the king, really admired Donne's intellect and his gift of writing and speaking. And he wanted Donne to go into the priesthood, a career which Donne, who had previously been such a kind of, party guy, had resisted. Well, finally, he decided to accept the king's offer / threat, pressure, and he converted and became a minister, and he was specifically at St. Paul's Cathedral, and he had the most magnificent church in England to be a priest at. And he began to write sermons, and he was a religious figure for the rest of his life. And imagine taking somebody whose writing is some of the best writing ever in the English language. I mean, somebody who could write as good as Shakespeare. But instead of writing plays, that guy writes sermons. They became the most thought-provoking, most edifying, most imaginative sermons ever written. So, maybe the king was on to something after all. Well, when Donne came to write sonnets, like everybody else that had written sonnets after Petrarch, it's like, well, how am I going to make my sonnets different or interesting? And his solution was, well, I won't write them to a woman at all. I'll write them to God. And specifically, they're about this lifestyle that Donne was living, that he knew was ultimately self-destructive. It wasn't the right lifestyle to be living, this kind of profligate, I'm loving and I'm drinking and I'm spending my money and I'm the prodigal son, except I haven't come back home yet. I'm just out there blowing my inheritance. And I know it's not the right way to be living my life, but what do I do about it? And he writes poems to God. And that's the sonnets that we have here. Let's look at number 14. Batter my heart, three-personed God. For you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand. Overthrow me, and bend your force, to break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like an usurped town, to another do, labor to admit you, but oh, to no end. Reason, your viceroy in me should defend, but is captive, and proves weak or untrue. Yet dearly I love you, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie, or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. All right, what does this poem mean? Okay, so once again, one line at a time. Let's just break it down. Three-person God. Well, that's a trinity, right? Batter my heart. You got to beat my heart. Beat me around. This is a challenging poem for us to read about because it's talking about a kind of domestic assault, abuse, right? For you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand. God, you have been gentle with me. You have knocked. You have breathed on me. You have shined a light, and you have sought to make me better so that I can stand and be well. But that's not going to work. That's not going to work. You have to, now look at the next series of words, which are all designed to be in contrast to knock, breathe, shine, seek, right? Instead it's break, blow, like the wind, burn, and make me new. You have to be rough with me. He compares himself to a town that's been conquered by an enemy. We want to let you in, labor to admit you, but we can't. And so if we're a town, well then what's the mayor of that town? The mayor of that town would be reason. And my reason tells me that we should defend ourselves against that enemy. But reason has been taken prisoner. He's a captive and proves weak or untrue. I love you dearly, God, and I want to be loved by you. But I am betrothed unto your enemy. Right? Like the town, but in this case, the enemy of God is Satan. I'm married to Satan. Not literally, not his real wife. He's not calling his wife Satan. He's saying metaphorically, right? I'm like married to the devil. So you need to divorce us and break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me. For unless you make me your slave, I will never be free. And I'll never be chaste unless you rape me. Now, these contrasts are what makes the poem so amazing, right? So shocking. And it's supposed to be shocking. It's on purpose. If you're asking God to rape you, and it's supposed to be shocking. Well, later writers that we'll be reading in this class continue to be influenced by the sonnet structure, and by these love poems. We still write sonnets today. John Milton, whose Paradise Lost we'll read at the end of our semester, he wrote sonnets specifically in model of Petrarch. The sonnet structure is easy to learn, lifetime to master. 14 lines, iambic pentameter. That means 5 feet of short long, ta-da, 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 ta-da. Right? And then think about the first 4 lines grouped together. If you look at Donne's Holy Sonnet, it does that, right? We have the first period at the end of 4 lines, and then 4 more lines together as a concept. The next 4 lines together, and then a couplet at the bottom. 2 lines at the bottom, which sum up or reject or in some way go beyond or turn a complete 180 from whatever you were talking about. The rhyme scheme, ABBA, right? Sounds easy, really hard to write. All right. Well, today we've talked about some basic differences between Renaissance and medieval culture. We've talked about the evolution of the sonnet and some of this love poetry, Petrarch, Shakespeare, Donne. All of these guys, their work is very accessible, and it's all available for free on the internet. So, if you're curious about more of you can find every Shakespeare sonnet read out loud. You can find all of Donne's sonnets. Petrarch's a little bit trickier because they all have to be translated from the Italian, but it's all totally out there. And what I encourage you to do is grab 1 or 2 and just try to walk your way through them the way that we did with a couple of the poems in each section. Just try to walk your way through them and figure out what they mean. When you first read through the first time, it may not make a lot of sense, and you're going to have to break it down 1 line at a time, 1 sentence at a time. But once you do that, the meaning comes through, and then you have to reflect on it and maybe do a little bit of writing, and you'll start to figure out what you think of it. And that's ultimately what it all comes down to. What do you think about these poems? How many of you can identify with this idea that, you know that you're living your life the way you shouldn't be living it? You know that you're living an improper life, and you're not living up to your potential. Whether it's Petrarch talking about how I feel like I've wasted my life writing love poems to this woman, or Donne saying I feel like I've wasted my life, which I should be spending devoted to God. But, human beings are weak. And how do we get out of this? Well, some of you will just point and laugh and say, he'd just get over it. Well, others of you might listen to those poems and think, I hear where he's coming from. I can identify with that. And that's ultimately all that these poems are asking you to do, is to identify and sympathize with those people. They lived 400 years ago. They're not that different from us. We started off our lecture today talking about how the difference between the medieval and the Renaissance period, but they were all still people. They all still wanted to love and be loved. They all still wanted to produce something that was going to live on after them. They wanted to be known. They wanted to feel like they had an effect on the world around them. That their life had some kind of meaning. That doesn't change. And plague and war and guns and religious difference, all of those things come and go. But people still want to be loved, and they still want to be remembered when they're gone. All right. Well, let's stop there, and next week we'll continue with some of the Renaissance prose. We're going to read non-fiction essays and work by, specifically we're going to read Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, excerpts from The Prince, which is a book of political science, how to conquer and rule effectively. And then we're also going to read some of Montaigne's letters, essays, and commentary. All right, thanks.